GURPS has a few main systems that branch out into various subsystems, so much so that I couldn't cover them all in a reasonable amount of time. Luckily, GURPS is the kind of game that doesn't necessarily fall apart if you ignore one or two systems. Still, complexity can add depth by changing some of the challenges of a game. With that in mind, we're going to circle back around and give some attention to the more minute details and rules that I skipped out on earlier, since even if I wouldn't recommend using them, if you're new and trying to get the hang of GURPS, it can still be nice to be aware of them for later on. Sub-attributes is where GURPS starts to get a little wacky with how much detail it provides. I consider these options edge cases, so I'll only gloss over them. You may not need these rules, but it's good to know they exist should you want them. Starting with build and size, your character can be of an unusual build or size than what their strength score might imply. Build refers to a character being skinnier or fatter than normal, which has various effects depending on their specific condition, such as affecting their disguise skill or, oddly enough, their swimming skill. Being fat makes you more recognizable, but also more buoyant. Meanwhile, size modifier has a similar effect pertaining to movement and disguise. If you're 3 foot tall when your species is normally 5 to 6, you're going to stand out and you're going to have trouble moving at the same place. And the reverse is also true. If you're a 9 foot tall member of that species, you're going to stand out and you're going to be able to move a lot easier because you have a longer stride. Character age is another optional rule, such as if your character is a child or senior citizen, as well as if they've been in the game so long that they move from any of those life stages to another. They're a bit complicated, so I won't explain them here, but they exist if you really feel like your game would be improved by your character dealing with the uncaring and unforgiving march of time. Your character's physical appearance can affect reaction rolls in, well, 2 ways, positively or negatively. If how your character looks is important to the game, GURPS has rules that cover a wide spectrum of situations, based on your gender, or your perceived gender as the case may be, and those that are attracted to it. Or, you can say fuck it and you're beautiful to all people and don't need to deal with that gender nonsense. GURPS has plenty of rules present that you can use as a guideline for inventing up any possible situation regarding looks, such as appearance or gender, if the ones that are present don't match your liking. In fact, coming up with something new if what you want isn't present is entirely within the spirit of the game. But do keep in mind, how attractive you are doesn't matter if you're playing a game meant to be like Doom or Hexen, where the objective is to butcher monsters mercilessly. But if you want getting naked and awkward with monsters to be an important part of the game, maybe pay a little extra attention to this section. Tech level is another important thing. It's a measure of how advanced the tools and sciences your character is familiar with. This can have an effect on skills, since something more or less advanced than what you're familiar with can influence how effective you are at using it. GURPS assumes all characters come from the same tech level, but as an advantage or disadvantage, you can have a higher or lower tech level. Additionally, all characters are familiar with at least one major culture and know their native language. Worth reiterating, these rules are optional. Keeping track of different tech levels and languages and cultures can get a little confusing with all the paperwork. If you think it doesn't add anything of value to your game, then you don't need to use it. Being fluent in English and Esperanto isn't important if you're playing a game about the shenanigans of 4 people stuck on a derelict space station several million years into the future. GURPS is also the sort of game where you don't necessarily need to keep track of every individual bullet, coin, or candle, unless that's important to the game you're running. A character's wealth is abstracted in GURPS, roughly how much you expect them to have and roughly how much they can get on the monthly. And just in case you haven't noticed the pattern, you can have more or less than is appropriate for the average player character, and it either costs or returns points to you. Lastly, your character can have specific reputations, social statuses, or ranks in organizations, for better or worse with all that entails. And none of these things are mutually exclusive. You can even have multiple reputations for different things your character has done. But once again, if you're using GURPS for a game where a character is insulated from social stratification, such as being lost in the wilderness somewhere, it may not be worth worrying about. Skill defaults. If you don't have a given skill, most skills have a default rating, usually an attribute at a steep penalty, or another related skill at a slightly more favorable penalty. Take, for example, the Exorcism skill. It defaults to your character's will rating, -6. Anybody with a brain can feasibly try shouting, "Zombie ghosts leave this place," to drive out evil spirits. However, even if you're not trained in exorcism specifically, knowing about religious rituals, magical rituals, or even theology allows you to default with those at a -3 penalty. Those skills give you an edge over somebody that's just really upset about ghosts living in their apartment rent-free. There is also some funky rules regarding how this can allow similar skills to be bought at a discounted rate. While this makes sense from a realism standpoint, since being good at one particular skill would make it easier to learn another, it adds a bit of extra bookkeeping, and I personally don't think it adds enough to warrant dealing with all that extra paperwork. It is there if you want it though. Specializations and familiarities. Some skills have a dagger or an obelisk next to them. These are skills that are a very broad category of similar related skills, such as artist or theology. These kind of skills usually have specialized defaults, such as how drawing and painting and a few others default to each other at a -2 or a -4 for body art such as tattoos. Related to specialties is familiarities. If a skill pertains to using equipment, different models can impose a penalty. For example, if you've got the artist skill specialized in drawing, your familiarities could include colored pencils and charcoal, and thus if you try to use markers, you'd be at a -2 penalty since you're not familiar with that medium. Unlike additional skill ratings, familiarities are basically free. If a character has a few hours to practice with something unfamiliar, or is familiar with so many different things in that field, you can waive that penalty. I'm sounding like a broken record at this point, I'm sure, but these rules, once again, add some additional bookkeeping, and are optional and should only be used if the differences in equipment make a meaningful difference in the game, such as technology used and developed by different starfaring races. Some skills are also associated with tech level, representing things people have done and know how to do through the ages, though the methods change as technology improves. The book gives the example surgery, with tech level 4 surgery for a mortally damaged arm being amputation, while a tech level 9 surgeon would be able to reattach a cloned arm to the patient. One such example of other tech-dependent skills is engineering, the ability to design and understand how machines are put together. Different tech levels will use different materials, as well as different methods for working with them. Another example is artillery, using oversized long-range weapons such as catapults, cannons, and missiles. Artillery also doubles as one of the specialty skills as well, since even though they're of the same tech level, a trebuchet and a catapult use very different mechanisms. This particular aspect of skills is an important part of the tech level subsystem, and is very useful if, for instance, you want to run a game about a guy who goes on wacky adventures through time and space, sometimes dragging people from different times with him. All the rules I've discussed so far have made the game more complicated, perhaps more so than people might like, myself included. So let me finish up this particular segment with one that does the complete opposite, and is even used in GURPS Ultra Lite in some capacity. Wildcards. These are basically very broad categories of skills, and naturally have a very high cost. They're treated as very hard skills and cost 3 times the normal amount on top of that. Plus, the defaulting rules don't apply to them in any way, shape, or form. But these drawbacks make it worthwhile. Wildcards can be as broad as guns, to indicate that a character can use literally any firearm. Futuristic, primitive, modern, extra-dimensional, doesn't matter, they know how to use it. Or it can refer to a profession, such as wizard, to indicate that they understand all sorts of different occult phenomenon. This particular rule is ideal if you don't want to spend too much time getting into the nitty-gritty details of GURPS, such as if you've got people who are a bit more used to working in broad archetypes, like, Dungeons and Dragons players. The fiddly bits with skills don't end there, though. Just as skills can be linked laterally through defaults and can be linked from narrow to broad through wildcards, we can drill down even further with techniques. Techniques are one of the less well-described parts of the GURPS core book, but from what it looks like, they're a way to reduce penalties for specific uses of skills. or to make yourself more effective with a narrow purview of a skill. While they aren't adequately explained, there's plenty of examples for both combat and non-combat techniques in the core book, so you can extrapolate from how to make the new ones from there. This is probably one of the things you'll find a lot of splat books dedicated to, and it also kind of reminds me of trade secrets and applications from the Dark Eye, which, hey, what else did the Dark Eye have that was tied to its skill system? Magic. In order to use magic in GURPS, you need the majory advantage. Using spells is similar to using skills, though with a few extra steps. You spend a certain amount of time preparing the spell, then when time is up, you roll to see if you succeed, then the spell takes effect. During the time you're preparing it, however, you can possibly be interrupted by needing to dodge an attack, or taking damage for some reason. At which point, this is where your willpower comes in to see if you can maintain the spell. Interestingly, each spell is in fact treated as an individual skill, and each spell may also have certain prerequisites such as other spells. You know, skill trees. It's also where fatigue points come in, since many spells require the expenditure of fatigue to cast, meaning Muscle Wizard is an entirely viable character concept. The list of spells is also fairly extensive, and there's likely a few splat books out there with yet more spells just in case you can't have enough of those. And a lot of the spells have effects that do something that's otherwise not physically possible, instead of just being different flavors of, give this many you're dead points to a target. Perfect for some kind of teenage wizardry school drama. And on the subject of supernatural powers, psionics. This is arguably the most simple of all the subsystems. Psionic powers are, simply put, advantages that are bought with a minus 10% modifier that indicates they're a part of a group of psionic powers. And anything that nullifies, protects against, or otherwise interacts with psionics will do so against that advantage with that modifier, even if it wouldn't otherwise. The rulebook states that a character can only learn one group of psionic powers, and gives a short list of 6 different groups as an example. Plus, each group, if applicable, comes with a new advantage that gives bonuses to rolls involving such psionic powers. GURPS, being a toolkit sort of game though, means that more groups can be made up by GMs, or the only one group rule can be ignored entirely. Otherwise, psionics are basically a method of getting supernatural advantages. It's very important, and I know I've said it entirely too many times in this video so far, but it bears repeating. You don't need to use every rule present. If it's not important to the gameplay or story that players are keeping track of every gun their character is familiar with using, then don't worry about the familiarity rules. Treat GURPS like an encyclopedia. Reading it cover to cover, trying to comprehend and include everything will likely drive you insane. Just pick pieces that you need to know and use them. After all, a more realistic game doesn't need to use magic and psionic rules, and you can ignore most of the advantages too since they're all exotic or supernatural. GURPS is a simple game with a lot of specific rules meant for edge cases. Some of them are even generic enough that you can transpose those edge case rules into other games besides GURPS that might be lacking them. So even if you don't plan on playing GURPS in the long term, it can be useful for your other games to be comfortable with it. Thanks for watching. If you found this useful or interesting, give me a thumbs up. And if you're interested in hearing about other complex RPGs put into simpler terms, consider subscribing as well. And remember, always be sure to read your rulebook. With that said, I am Aaron Darshedel, and I will see you all next time.